was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios for a year in 2005 for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course, but most internships aren't. It did have some perks beyond education, though. To adults, it might not seem like a big one, but to most kids at the time, would have shit themselves over it. Since I worked directly with the editors and animators, I got to view the new episodes days before they were even aired. I'll get right to it without giving too many unnecessary details. They had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat sapped of creativity. So it took them a little longer to start up the new season, but the delay lasted even longer for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with the season 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back for several months. 2 other interns and I were in the editing room along with the lead animators and sound editors for the final cut. We received the copy of what was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that it isn't final yet, animators often put up a mock title card instead of the official one as a little inside joke, with phony, oftentimes lewd titles such as How Sex Doesn't Work instead of Rockabye Bavalve, the episode where SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a baby sea scallop. There's nothing particularly funny except for a few work-related chuckles. So when we saw the title card, Squidward Suicide, we didn't think it more than a morbid joke. One of the interns did a small throat laugh at it, and the happy-go-lucky music played as normal. The story began with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes as normal. We hear SpongeBob laughing outside and Squidward stops playing, yelling at SpongeBob to keep it down as he had a concert that night and needed to practice. SpongeBob complies and goes to see Sandy with Patrick. The bubble splash scene comes up as we see the ending of Squidward's concert. This is where things begin to seem off. While playing, a few frames repeat themselves, but the sound doesn't. The sound was synced up with the animation, so that's not exactly common. But when he stopped playing, the sound finishes as if the skip never happened. There's slight murmuring in the crowd before they begin to boo him. This wasn't the normal cartoon booing that's common in the show. You clearly hear malice in it. Squidward was in full frame and looked visibly afraid. The shot goes to the crowd, with SpongeBob in center frame, and he too is booing at Squidward, which is not very much like him at all. That isn't the oddest thing, though. What's odd is that everyone had hyper-realistic eyes. They were very detailed. They weren't shots of real people's eyes, but something a bit more real than CGI. The pupils were red, too. Some of us looked at each other, obviously confused, but since we weren't the writers, we didn't really question its appeal to the children, yet. The shot goes to Squidward as he sat on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view goes out of his porthole window, and it was of a night sky. So, it wasn't very long after the concert. At this point, there was no sound. There was literally no sound. There wasn't even feedback from the speakers in the room. It was as if the speakers were turned off, though their status showed them clearly working. He simply sat there, blinking in the silence for about 30 seconds until he began to sob softly. He put his tentacles around his eyes and cried quietly for a full minute more, while all the sound in the background started slowly growing from nothing to barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze through a forest. The screen slowly began to zoom in on his face, and by slowly I mean you would only notice it if you looked at shots 10 seconds apart side by side. His sobbing got louder and more full of hurt and anger. The screen twitched a bit for a split second as if it twisted in on itself, then returned to normal. The wind through the trees sound got slowly louder and more severe, as if a storm was brewing somewhere. The eerie part was that this sound and Squidward's sobbing sounded real, as if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but as if the speakers were just holes that the sound was coming through from the other side. And as good a quality as studios would like to have, they don't purchase the equipment for the quality to be that good. Below the sound of the wind and sobbing, ever so faintly, something sounded like laughing. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so you would have a hard time pinning it down. After 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently as something flashed over the screen, as if one single frame was replaced. The lead animation editor paused and rewound frame by frame, and what we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The face was mangled and bloodied, and one eye was popped out and dangling over his upturned face. He was stripped down to his underwear, and his stomach was crudely cut open with his entrails laying beside him. He was laying on some pavement that was probably a road. The most upsetting part was that there was the shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence bags or markers, and the angle was completely off for the shot to be designed to be evidence. It would seem the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death. We were of course mortified, but we pressed on, hoping that it was just a sick joke. The screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing. He was louder than before, and only half of his body was in the frame. There was now what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was also done hyper-realistically, looking as if you touched it you'd get blood on your fingers. The sound of wind was now sounding as a gale blowing through a forest. There were even the snapping sounds of branches, the laughing, in a deep baritone voice, lasted at longer intervals and came more frequently. After about 20 seconds, the screen again twitched and showed a single frame photo. The editor was reluctant to go back, as we all were, but he knew he had to. This time the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl no older than the first child. She was laying on her stomach, her beret in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was also popped out. And she was also stripped down to her underwear. Her entrails were piled on top of her, above a crude cut along her back. The body was on the street, and the photographer's shadow was visible. It was very similar in size and shape to the first, but I had to choke back vomit. And one intern, the only female in the room, ran out. The show resumed about 5 seconds after the second photo played. All sound stopped, like it was the scene that it started. He put his tentacles down and his eyes were done in hyperrealism like the others were in the beginning of this episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot, and pulsating. He stared at the screen, as if watching the viewer, and after about 10 seconds, he started sobbing, but he didn't cover his eyes this time. The sound was piercing and loud, and most fear-inducing of all was his sobbing. It was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The sound of the wind came back, and so did the deep voice laughing. The next still frame photo lasted for a good 5 seconds, and the animator was able to stop it on the fourth, and backed it up. This time, the photo was of a boy, about the same age as the other children, but the scene was different. The entrails were just being pulled out of a stomach wound by a large hand, and the right eye was popped out and dangling with blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded, and it was hard to believe, but the next one was different, though we couldn't tell how. He went on to the next, and it was the same thing. Then he went back to the first and played them a little quicker. I lost it. I threw up all over the floor. The animating and sound editors were gasping at the screen. The 5 frames were not as if they were 5 different photos. They were played out as if they were frames from a video. We saw the hand slowly lifting out the entrails. We saw the kid's eyes focusing on it, and we even saw 2 frames of the kid beginning to blink. The sound editor told us to stop. He had to call in the creator to see it. Mr. Hillenberg arrived within 15 minutes. He was confused as to why he was called down there, so the editor continued the episode. Once the few frames were shown, all screaming and all sound again stopped. Squidward was staring at the viewer, his entire face in the frame for about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out, and that deep voice said, "Do it." The next thing we see is a shotgun in Squidward's hands. He immediately puts the gun in his mouth and pulls the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter splattered on the wall in bed behind him, and he flies back from the force. The last 5 seconds of the episode show his body on the bed, on his side with one eye dangling on what's left of his head, just above the floor, staring blankly at it. And the episode ends. Mr. Hillenberg was obviously angry about it. He demanded to know what the hell was going on. Most people had left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it into my mind and caused me horrible nightmares. I wish I hadn't stayed. The only theory we could think of was that someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here edited the file. The CTO was called in to analyze what happened, but the analysis of the file did show that it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it happening was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware as well as glitches, as if the timestamp may have been glitched and shown the wrong time, but everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day, nobody does. There was an investigation due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. No children seen was identified, no clues were gathered from the data involved, no physical clues in the photos. I never believed in unexplainable phenomena before. But now that I have seen, if something happens and I can't prove anything beyond physical evidence, I think twice about things.